Come get some.
Where it would start as a game company, Sakaguchi, he created the game Final Fantasy, and that was the most successful role-playing game of its time and its genre. And it's gone on to make 8, 9, and 10, and I think it's on to Final Fantasy 11.
There's a whole group of anime films that are based on video games.
Something's not right! It shouldn't be happening!
Something's attracting them.
Final Fantasy is an anime. It's got very much an anime feel to it. It was made for an American audience because there's more money, but at the same time, it definitely is an anime. Final Fantasy is a gorgeous work. It's incredibly stunning use of computer animations like nothing I've ever seen before, in all honesty.
Two coming through the wall.
The quality is just really so high that it looks almost human. I mean, their characters are almost too good.
Zion has to be warned.
How?
Someone has to get to a drop point.
What? Are you crazy? We can't broadcast now.
We have to.
I'll go.
There isn't much time.
I'll make it.
Sakaguchi wanted to make actors that didn't exist and digital characters that pushed the level of realism to the point where some people could believe that they are real.
Pardon me.
I'm sorry. I was in my own little world. Is it important?
Very.
At the time, we were just finishing up Final Fantasy, and I was pretty much done. And the producer called me up and said, the Wachowski brothers have handed the script to us, and they've seen some of the stuff we've done on Final Fantasy, and they'd like us to do this piece. And I jumped at it. I said, I would love to. And I gathered 3 or 4 of the animators, and I said, let's do a test. Let's try and make this happen. We put together a quick piece that we just grabbed our lead character, Aki. We gave her a haircut, gave her short hair, put her in a black leather suit, and they gave us a model of a sentinel, and we animated them together just to show that we could do it.
Get to the gun turrets.
The Wachowski brothers handed the script to us, and we read it and realized that we'd need to build up the action scenes. The action was described a little bit, but not in depth. Tani Kunitaki, our art director and storyboard artist, worked with the Wachowskis and kind of came up with a lot of the extra story that we needed to fill in. We did look at the Matrix quite a bit to try and rebuild what they had done and get the same feel.
Osiris is very unique in that it is the most literal of all the pieces. Because it's computer animation, it almost looks exactly like the movie and feels like the movie. I think the audience's expectations are going to be very, very similar as what the expectations would be if it was live action. So we tried to approach the whole thing with the same team, to a great extent, as the movies.
We got the Sentinel model and the Digger model, and then we also got a lot of conceptual drawings.
Osiris has a lot of things, characters in common with the movies. The Sentinels is a character. The Osiris is like a brothership to the Nebuchadnezzar. These are all characters that have to have the same life and the same depth.
We actually got some reference the way the tunnels look, the way a Sentinel swarming looks, where you have hundreds and thousands of Sentinels in a corridor.
There are a lot of Sentinels in Osiris, so that's one of the things I've been doing, lately. Is just, as well as the Neb, recreating the engine that I made all of the Sentinel sounds for, and it's very complex for the movie.
Go.
So now I can kind of spawn new Sentinels out of that engine.
For me, it was a lot about the detail of the world and the texturing team that we had for sets and props. And they had developed a lot of the tools and shaders to create that stuff on Final Fantasy. So creating a lot of that, especially the more rustic, rusted metals and stuff like that, were much easier for them. I think the greatest improvements were in the faces, as well as the skin and the bodies.
Sentinels.
Damn it.
Traditionally, the way a computer renders these things, if you think of like an eggshell, it just renders, an eggshell's pretty hollow, but it just renders the edge and the side of it. But in skin, there's volume, and light goes inside and bounces around and comes out. And all these complexities hasn't really been thought out. In Final Fantasy, we really had a lot of cloth covering up the characters all the time. And in the opening sequence, we knew it was going to be very bare, and we need to see muscles deforming. And it was something we really tried to push much further than people had done before.
Goodbye, Thaddeus.
Goodbye, Joey.
Jue, we knew she was Asian. We wanted to create a very beautiful, soft look to her, yet also have a little bit of strength to her. We actually got some reference footage that we could use to get like skin texture references, stuff like that. Women, and we just compiled different looks and kind of figured out what look would work best for Jue. The brothers wanted it to be extremely sexy and erotic at the same time. So we put as much of that in as we could by the design of the outfits and the performance. The feeling of being handed that to work in the Matrix, I love the film so much that to be given that opportunity was great.
It's unique in that the whole piece of Osiris could be in the Matrix movie.
多分記憶として2歳か3歳ぐらいなんですけど、こう天井のこう木目っていうか木の木目、例えばこういう木目あるんですけど、それをずっと眺めた時になんか動いてた記憶があるんですよね。動いてた木目が動いてて、それを例えば母親だとか、兄貴だとかそんな止まってるよっていう、ことを言われた段階からあれ
森本監督はですね、今回の監督なので私は最も長く仕事をしている監督ですが、プライベートは非常にユニークで面白い方ですね。特にもうお酒は死ぬほど好きで、1年に1回私の家に来てですね、私が、こっそり貯めている高級なワインも家中にあるお酒を全部飲んでですね、森本さんはただそのお酒を飲んでいても食事をしていても音楽を聴いていても常に彼の中に見える世界というのは彼の作品の中のイマジネーションを呼び起こすエッセンス、その種であり、彼は非常にその日常的な世界を描くのが得意な監督なんですが、ただ私たちが見ている世界とは違うもの、違うところを常に見ていると。
Morimoto is the first director that we started with, just because he's a good friend of mine and Takeuchi's and Tanaka's. But at the same time, he's also the director who's taken longest to make his film. I've been working on Beyond for over 2 years and talking to him about Animatrix for, I think, close to 3 actually.
今回森本監督にこのアニマトリックスのお願いをした時にもうやるんであればオリジナルでやりたいと、シナリオコンテ開発に時間がかかりました。森本さんはいつもそのコンテを書くのが遅い監督さんで日本でも有名なんですけれども。
He's had multiple stories rejected. Every time even a small detail has been looked askance at, he's gone back to square one and just started from scratch. And that's kind of his nature actually. He's not really, I don't think his style lends itself to successive approximation and small increments. Yeah, he's kind of a producer's nightmare in a way.
Ready!
Bullseye! それはだからその前に言ったようにこれがこう動いてるとかそういうことを楽しめる。例えば子供それを例えば知ったからといってじゃあこの世界は何なんだってこう追求しないじゃないですか。どっちかしなくてそのまま受け入れて遊んでるということでだったらそれだったらいいっていうか、向こうにそっちのアイデアだったらっていうかそっち方向だったら気づかないでこっちにそこから出ようとかきっと思わないだろう。
Which brings in this whole subtext that Larry and Andy are kind of fond of putting forth, which is, things that happen in the real world that aren't supposed to happen, psychic phenomena or, deja vu. Deja vu. Or ghosts. All of this is a result of problems in programming the Matrix. So Beyond explores just that aspect of the story of the Matrix, which is
the rules that humans live by every day of our lives, and yet they're being broken here in the same way that a movie can break rules. But this is in, the real world that these kids live in.
One of his characteristics is that he's got such a unique and slightly skewed vision of the world that he's kind of not really seeing things the same way that the rest of us are.
今回のビヨンドの作品の中でも普通の人たちが日常では見過ごしてしまうような不思議な、例えば路地の向こう側には何があるのか、この壁の向こうには何があるのか、この電柱は夜になるとどうなるのか、そういうさまざまなディテール、そういったものが彼のイマジネーションの中で融合してこの作品の中で非常に独特な世界を培えるものとなっていると思います。森本監督はビヨンドを撮るときにですね、彼のスタジオがある町吉祥寺であるとか。
Yuki?
Mark Larry, who is the key sound designer on Beyond, is in Japan now, not only spotting with the director, but he brought a recording rig, and he's been recording tons and tons, hours of material in that specific neighborhood and all the outlying areas to really get the feel of the real place.
今回の作品の一番最初に横断歩道の音っていうか、それはトーリャンセっていう曲なんですけど。
A lot of people don't get stuff, some of the stuff I think which is very local, like the street sign that's playing that song, Torianse, which is a very local kind of Japanese thing. This is to help sight impaired people cross the street.
それはだから日本の昔の曲っていうか、最近こう近くで探そうとしたら違う曲になってたりとかして、ちょっと遠くの方まで行ったんですけど。
Mark had to go to that an intersection that had those traffic signals, but in a fairly quiet place, and they went there like 3 in the morning before the traffic started, so they could get a clean recording of this signal.
どうしてもその曲じゃないと、自分はいけないと思ってて、なんでその曲かっていうと、その曲に込められた意味があって、そこを通れる人っていうのはすごいちょっと特殊な人っていうか、選ばれし者っていうか。
What we're going to try to do sound effects wise is break the rules in different ways and in contrapuntal ways rather than just parallel ways to the way that the images are breaking the rules. The same errors that you see visually we're going to suggest, but not necessarily at the same time in the same way. I think it's going to be a gas.
Hello? Where is everyone?
今までアニメーションで描こうとするのは想像で、もちろん今まで見てきたものとかっていうのを頭の中でこう組み上げて描くんですけども、もしかしたらそうじゃなくて、実際に女の子はこの時に、どういうリアクションをするんだろうっていうのを実際に撮ったら、今回現に撮ってこういうことするんだとかっていうこともまた新しい発見だったりとか、実際にこう外に行っていろんな人間観察っていうか、人を見てるとみんなリアクションが違う、もちろん違いますよね。その中の歴史だったりとか、性格だったりとかするんで。
I've been working on Beyond for a couple of years now, and it's just in mixing it over the last couple of days that I finally really feel like I've gotten it, like I'm really seeing all the stuff that's hidden in there. There were a couple shots where there's all this stuff happening in the background that I never even noticed, and it's not because I haven't been paying attention. I've been totally immersed in this project for longer than I care to remember.
I figured this out yesterday.
But there's these things in there that are very important to him, but somehow they're hidden. There's a lot of ambiguity built into it.
普通では見過ごしてしまうようなシーンとか世界の中でちょっと何かが違う、ちょっと何かが起こっている、見ている人たちは何回も繰り返して見ることによってこの作品の世界の独特な雰囲気の中に引き込まれていくと思います。
Some people see it and basically see something which is very literal and try and make sense of it. In reality, I think it's best viewed without expectations that it's going to really make sense. It's a very challenging movie. Some people hate it. They're not able to really free their minds.
大宅主、お前を逮捕する。
Cowboy Bebop is an excellent TV series that introduces elements that we would associate with Hollywood film noir detective stories into a sci-fi setting.
Watanabe is, I'd say, more contemporary. I mean, Cowboy Bebop is very recent and very postmodern. He's a very good animator for this generation.
Tanaka, my co-producer, had also recommended Watanabe as one of the guys that we can get because he's in a very Andy and Larry Wachowski vein.
その中で渡辺さんがもうごめんなさい、渡辺さんがマトリックス大好きだとということを彼から聞いて、もう彼に頼むしかない。そのペアになるストーリーの目覚めることができなかった探偵ディテクティブストーリーというのをオリジナルで自分で書きまして。
キッズストーリーは、ラリー&アンディが、随分最初から、そのシノプシスを、開発しました。最初話が来た時は1本だけを頼みたいということだったので、それでいくつかシャーキーブラザーズが書いている脚本をいただいて、この中のどれかかあるいはオリジナルかでやってほしいという話を受けたんですよ。それでオリジナルを最初やろうかなと思ったんですけど、一本そのキッズストーリーっていうのがプロダクションの方から、田中さんの方から脚本は今完成している話の大体後半部分というか学校のシーンから以降しかなかったんですよ。で基本的に学校のシーンだけで構成されていたんですけど、そこにいくつかの要素を加えればもっと面白くなるんじゃないかというふうに
Really added this beautiful arc to it.
このキッズストーリーのテーマというのはそのアメリカの、学校をテーマにしているんですけれども、アメリカの学校っていうのがどういうものなのか全く分からなかったので、サンフランシスコのマトリックスの撮影現場の近くにあった学校に取材に行ってそこを参考に書いています。そこがなかなかいい感じだったので、割とそこの学校に近い感じで描いています。その学校を取材に行った時にクレイトン君本人にも会えたので、その時にビデオなどを撮らせてもらって、それを参考にアニメーターが作画しています。クレイトン君に実際の内容と同じようになるべく演技してもらうようにして、それを元に作画しています。ただしスケートボードのシーンと壁をよじ登るシーンはさすがにできなかったんですけど、それ以外は割といろいろな本編と同じ演技をしてもらって、それを見ながら作業しています。通常の普通のアニメーションの画像というか画面の質感みたいなものがちょっと飽きたというか、あまりにありふれたものにはしたくないなと思っていたんですよ。でキッズストーリーに関しては作画監督の橋本くんっていうのがこういうタッチでやったらどうだろうという提案がありまして。
It looks amazing. I mean, for Japanese animation particularly, it's really stylish.
特別っていう風に見られるとちょっと恥ずかしいですけど、あれは、どっちかというと古いやり方のような気がしますけど、昔の日本のアニメーションは結構ああいうラフっぽいやつが多かったので、そういうのが結構好きだったりするから、特に自分的には特別なとは思ってないんですけどね。
アニメーションっていうのは一度手で描いた後
原画さんが絵で描いてきた後、動画っていうセクションがそれを綺麗な絵にクリーンアップして、その後色を塗るっていう作業になるんですけども、元の一番最初の原画が描いた絵っていうのがすごく味がある場合が多いんですよ。あまり綺麗な線で描かれた絵ではないんですけど、逆にそれが非常に手書きの味みたいなものもあって、独特のその人の線の感じみたいなものもあって、それはとてもいいものなんですけど、ただ常に映像になった時にはそれはもう生かされていないんですよ。だからその味みたいなものをフィルムに出ないかな、生かせないかなっていうのは以前から思っていたことではあったんですけど、まあ非常に手間がかかるのと、ラフに描いた絵だと線がつながっていないと色が塗れないんですけど、通常は色を塗れるようにそれは別のレイヤーを、色だけのレイヤーっていうのを作ってるんですけど、そうすると枚数も2倍になってしまうので、まあ面倒なんですけども、まあ、今回は時間的にも予算的にも余裕があったので、それができるんじゃないかということで試してみたんですけど、普通のテレビのスケジュールだったら不可能だと思います。
He's experimenting with something that he's wanted to do, but finally he gets an episode where it starts hyper real and then it begins to swish and swash a little bit and then get into very rubbery reality, which I can see as a, somebody who's wanted to do something and play around with a thing. He's like, oh my God, this would be great. This is the perfect episode where I can fool around with that. But it really works to the psychological advantage, the psychological underpinnings of that episode.
We had to be very respectful of the real world because as far as the kid knows, he's in the real world. We, recorded everything with real skateboards and real surfaces for all the moves and the jumps and the turns and everything. Working with Mark Larry on it is Eddie Kim, who happens to be a former skateboarding champ. Eddie recorded and built all of the skateboarding. So the challenge there was to make it feel very real, but at the same time feel not so real. This kid is somebody that by nature expands on the limitations around him. So he's kind of riding that skateboard the way most kids in our world wish they could ride a skateboard.
実はそのディテクティブストーリーに決まるまでに、20数本のシナリオを書き上げました。さまざまな、監督さんであるとかシナリオライターにお願いしたんですが、結果、ラリー&アンディはなかなか気に入らずにですね、もう正直プロデューサーとしてどうしようかというふうにしていた時に渡辺監督が、僕のアイデアがあると。でそこで出したものが非常に素晴らしいクオリティで、決まりました。
昔からハードボイルド映画とかそういうものが好きだったので、そういうものが一度やってみたいなと思っていたので、それはマトリックスの世界観にも合うんじゃないかと思ったので、そういうハードボイルド映画とトリニティの話を組み合わせようと思いました。
Detective story is actually a great little idea. It's a simple idea. It's like the old Twilight Zones, in the 50s. It's not like they're these grand stories and big ideas. They're small. They're small, but they're perfect. It's like the facets of a diamond.
Detective story is in some ways like Osiris, in some ways like Kid Story, in that it connects to the movie. There's a character in common. So we want that piece to feel like it is in that same sphere of the Matrix. All the people in Detective Story, they could go from Detective Story into the Matrix movies. It has to feel like they could, in fact, make that leap.
The model for the score is really Chinatown, and it doesn't veer too far from the jazz concept. I played it like I was scoring a 1950s noir B movie.
最初自分がアニメーションの世界に入った時からあまりアニメと実写っていうものをそんなに区別しないで考えていたので、むしろマトリックスの映画なんかを見てもアニメと実写っていうものがすごく近づいているような感じがするんですよ。そういうだからもっとボーダーレスに仕事をしていければいいかなと思うんですけど。
I would not want people to think of this as a story literally about a robot, because it's really about a mind which is robotic, which is really a reference to limited, linear, rigid thinking.
We ended up short a director at one point because kind of scheduling conflicts forced one of our directors to leave the project. And so Andy and Larry suggested, well, why don't we get Peter Chung, get that Aeon Flux guy.
The time when I was developing Aeon Flux, I was actually working on Rugrats for Nickelodeon. And I found the Rugrats characters to be very limiting in what they could do. I mean, they're very squat and short, and they had short legs, and they're babies. And so I wanted to go completely the opposite direction and create characters that were very athletic and acrobatic and had long limbs. And also, at the time, I was looking at a lot of expressionist art, like Egon Schiele.
He was doing what I was doing, which was, taking the influence from a distance, trying to put it into our work, and then trying to shove it out to the American public. And the difference that he did with Flux as compared to what I did with Spawn was I didn't quite change the drawing style nearly as dramatically as he did. And that might have been the one thing that, again, we weren't quite prepared. You got to sort of ease the American public into change, if you will.
That stuff was so nice to see on television. I mean, because it was violent, sexy, and cool.
He might have been just a little bit ahead of his time. If he was doing Aeon Flux now, I got a feeling it would be, a lot more successful, because now we understand sort of anime.
They said they wanted action. At that point, I had a couple of ideas which I thought about and pitched them. And I came up with the idea that just as in The Matrix, in the original movie, humans are immersed in an artificial world created by the machines. What if the machines were immersed in a world created by the humans?
He's a really good writer. He wrote a very kind of philosophical look at the story, kind of the explanation, the kind of deconstruction of Matriculated. He gave us that, and then he gave us the actual story.
I think I was lucky because I came in late in the process, and I think probably they had achieved a lot of what they were after with the earlier directors. And so coming in late, I was able to pretty much do what I wanted. The disadvantage I had was that I didn't have a lot of time. The main challenge was in creating a robot subject, a robot character that came across as a living, thinking, feeling consciousness. The human characters, they're pretty much the way I always draw humans, so that was easy. But the robot had to have the right look of menace, but at the same time a look of innocence. And there was a very strict rule that it could not have a human face or have human anatomy. I literally spent months designing and redesigning and revising the robot design.
Peter is a 2D guy. And he said to me at one point, you draw a person walking across a room 100 times, that's it. It's lost its effulgence, it's lost its fascination.
It was such a relief to use 3D elements because I'm used to doing everything by hand, and drawing it, every pose, every frame. And allowing the computer to do a lot of the drudgery was just a tremendous relief. I mean, you still have to animate the characters by hand. The computer generates the image, but the performance and the gesture all has to be placed frame by frame.
Because Matriculated is, in many ways, the most abstract and the most demanding, I think, probably, of the audience.
And it's certainly the most psychologically challenging. I mean, it deals with hallucinations.
He's taking you on a trip. Not just the psychedelic aspects of it, it's something that's the kind of thing that Peter feels and thinks about, which is, let's look at it from a totally different point of view.
Every night when we dream, we immerse ourselves into an artificial world of our own making, and they're very convincing. So I thought, well, what if a machine could be put inside a human dream? I felt completely free to make it, as as wild and colorful and unpredictable as a dream.
The piece is really the anti-matrix. In Matriculated, there is the real world, but then there is the world inside the human mind, which is completely internally interpreted world. So it's going to be a gigantic challenge to let the audience in on what the humans are letting the machines in on.
A good deal of Matriculate takes place in this imagined world. So I was attempting to go with more hard-edged and more reality-based music for the real world sequences. And for the imagined sequences, I approached it with a very kaleidoscopic kind of synthesizer, sampler-based sounds that do not reference to actual instruments.
I mean, each of those worlds they go through has to be its own, it is its own sound world. I mean, it's its own symphony, you know, with its own set of instruments. It's kind of like it has to be real, but it has to be abstract at the same time. Last week I was in the studio recording all of these sounds. We built all these contraptions, and I'm in there squeaking and whooshing and swinging and turning and, you know, making all these crazy sounds.
I sort of see the robot as an innocent. And in the end, my hope is that you maybe start to feel a little bit of empathy for it.
It's very Peter.
Andy and Larry are fans of a movie called Ninja Scroll by Yoshiaki Kawajiri.
Ninja Scroll, I thought, was one of the best examples of trying to bridge the gap between doing sort of a true full animation like Akira and Ghost in the Shell, and then having a limited budget. And Ninja Scroll, they moved the bar. It's one of the first places too where I noticed the way they edited in terms of like flashes and pops to just sort of jar you a little bit. It didn't have to come with a big explosion. Sometimes you can just go and do like color flashes. And you just go, whoa, okay, that meant something big.
His films are full of movement and really stunning visuals. People chasing each other across rooftops. Great fighting scenes.
That was too easy. What's the problem? Where's your concentration? Maybe you regret taking the red pill.
He was pretty much at the top of our short list, Kawajiri-san. And it turns out he's a big fan of The Matrix. He agreed to work on Animatrix on the condition that he could submit some of his own stories. And he came up with 2 stories, Program and World Record, which we also made with Takeshi Koike directing.
これが大体お話作るときパッと思いついたもんで、ワールドレコードもプログラムも3日ぐらいでやるとしたらこういう話だってパッと作っちゃった話なんで。で、その何かこのワンとの関連性みたいなもんが、ちょっとあった方がいいかなということで、その例の裏切り者の
You betrayed us, didn't you?
シークエンスをあれを、ちょっと使ってみて。
Program really explored a facet of the Matrix, which was that simulations, even if you know that they're simulations, can still be dangerous. Like you can still be tricked by them, or you can still want to believe in a simulation. It's just like that character Cypher in the first film. He chooses the simulation even though he knows it's not real.
要するにマトリックスのオムニバス作品の中で自分の個性を出す。まずアクションをどうやって入れようか。でそのアクションもやっぱりそのマトリックスの世界でそのチャンバラできねえかなとか、っていうとこから始まってまして、シミュレーションの中での戦闘シミュレーションの一つとしてで、それだけじゃつまんないなということで、そこに何か主人公が知らないプログラムが入って意外な結果に終わると。でその6分という。
I wanted to go back with you. I love you.
No!
Well, he is really unafraid of melodrama. And I mean, he just lets it fly in terms of an operatic. And he's real specific, though, which is what sells it. And I know for a fact he's a big Western fan. And so there's a real flavor of a kind of the great Westerns where you're suddenly in like a high noon moment or a searcher's moment or something like that. His fabric moves are really audacious and big. So if you're lucky, somebody's wearing a cape.
We got some kind of a note that they wanted the armor and all the weaponry to be historically very, very accurate. And so we did a lot of research around town looking for just the right Japanese swords from a certain era, and the armor had to be this kind of wood with that kind of metal. After doing this research, then we basically determined that it was kind of a translation vagueness, that ultimately the director thought just like we do, which is that it just has to rock. It's the same approach that the Wachowski brothers have.
I think of all the animes, Program is the most traditionally anime in terms of style. The protagonist, the way her character was drawn looks more anime. The big eyes and the kind of light reflections in the eyes and that kind of thing.
やっぱり二次元っていうものの力をやっぱり特にそのシミュレーション内での空間っていうのはイメージボード書いてくれと箕輪の方に依頼して書いてもらった中に最初美術にやっぱすすきがをブラックベタであるだからキャラの方にもなるだけブラックを入れ込もうとで美術とキャラクターのマッチングを図ろうじゃないかとで花札っていうのがありましてこれはトランプみたいなもんです日本の古い歴史のある、そういうカードなんだけどでそのデザインというのも非常に日本的で
That's an anime that actually takes place in medieval times. It doesn't really lend itself to, a track from Prodigy or something. I react very strongly to armies of fighters on horseback and that kind of grand medieval imagery. It's really a masterful piece of medieval action.
要するに演出っていうことも自分が面白いと思ったことを人にどうしても伝えたいとで人に伝えるにはどういう手法を取れば理解してもらえるのかこの面白さを分かってくれ、それを伝えたいでそれが演出なんだと。
Second Renaissance was actually the first story that Andy and Larry provided us with. It fills in however many hundreds of years between the current day and what you see at the beginning of the first Matrix film, which is after the machines have already developed the Matrix and have connected the human race to this enormous power plant.
アンディ&ラリーと打ち合わせをしてでもそこのところは本当はぜひとも描きたいところだったんだというふうに話した時に今回も描かれているんだけども非常にマシンたちが人間のエネルギーを
Mahiro Maeda, the director of Second Renaissance, he directed an animated series in Japan called Blue Submarine 6. It's kind of a sci-fi action series, and he's one of the directors who was on our short list. He's very talented, incredibly youthful and energetic, and very focused. He doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he has a cup of tea, like a little Chinese teapot next to his desk. He's a surfer. He's kind of unique in that environment that he's in.
ぜひやりたいと。アメリカのスクリプトで日本のアニメの技術で作るのはちょっと実際やってみたいことだったのでやはり内容に関してですかねアンディとラリーが提示してきたスクリプトを自分の思いとかこういう風にしたいとかそういうものをうまくブレンドしながら大変だったと思います、僕的にはそれをどういう風に仕上げるかなって思った時にこれは神話だなとか思ったんですよね マトリックスの神話というか、人間がやってきたことのカリカチュアなんですよね。
All of the camera movements, the camera angles that he's chosen, the style of animation, everything counts for something. The references to Vietnam, to Tiananmen Square, he's got so much on a subconscious level that it's just like a Jungian parade.
この絵どっかで見たことあるなっていうようなものにしておいた方が、その見てくれた人に対して強いインパクトを、何かを思い起こしてもらえるっていうか、いかにその人間がそういう割とバイオレンスを行ってきたかっていうことを思い出してもらうというのが狙いとしてあります。
It's like this rapidly cut newsreel kind of historical recapitulation of a century or a couple centuries of time. There's just a million different sound design challenges.
Sell order now!
On the phone. Can you please get him on the phone now?
Line one for you.
Someone get something forward and sell it! Sell it! Sell it!
Everything's coming through as being sound driven and sound effects driven. That works very well with the music and with even the narrator's voice, which was, processed to not sound like a normal human being.
Welcome to the Zion Archive. You have selected historical file number 12-1.
今回のセコンドルネサンス2でもインストラクターがやはりその彼のオリジナルキャラクターで出てくるんだけれども、その前田さん自身は普段は自分のキャラクターデザインしないで、青の6号も別の方がキャラクターデザインしてるのね。だけども今回はそのほとんど全てのキャラクターを彼自身がそのキャラクターしてて。
手始めに始めたのはインストラクターですかね。インストラクターとあとRB1163 でしたっけ、63R か、なんかロボットがいるんですけど、その2つからですね。でインストラクターはさっき言ったより神話的な構成を狙っていこうっていうことだったので、日本のその古いお寺に残っている曼荼羅の絵を参考にして、仏画の技法ですね、仏画のスタイルを非常に意識して、でさらにそれをもともと仏教っていうのはインドから来たものですから、インドの美術が持ってるそのセクシャルな感じですか、その女性美みたいなものを加味してうまく、それとなんか今風なものを混ぜて作ろうとか思って作ってます。
He's got an incredible eye for mechanical design and robots and just weird machinery.
でロボットの方はこれはもうウェブで連載していたマトリックスのコミックスの方に、そのマトリックス本編のオリジナルのメカニックをデザインされている方が漫画描いてるんですけど、一応それとのつながりを保つために同じデザインにしてくれという兄弟からの要請があったので、そこから起こしました。はっきりしている部分以外に関しては逆にすごく自由にやらせてくれたので、とてもやりやすかったと思います。
There are moments in Second Renaissance that I did refer to the first movie, specifically when the power plant was shown. Well, I started out with the same music and actually developed it a little further, because when the power plant was shown in the Matrix, it was fairly short. So in Second Renaissance, there's actually quite a bit of actual footage on the power plant, so I could carry it pretty far with that.
ブルードームアプローチ。こちら青の6番艦竜王。青の本局侵入許可を願います。
前田さんの作品ですと、やはり青の6号という、アニメーションがあります。これは、デジタル技術を全面的に採用した全く新しい映像として、作られたと思います。もうそれでもそうですね、何年前だろう、3、4年前でしょうか。
This was the first time he had really been given a chance to use computer graphics in anything, and more than anything else, I think he was really just trying to push it and see what could be done with it.
To westernize it sometimes looks like you're cutting between two different films because you have these very three-dimensional vehicles and mechanical monsters, and then these very two-dimensional, very flat human characters.
当時はやっぱりグッドっていう人もいたらバッドっていう人も両方いたんですよ。でも今はやり方、青の6号のやり方がメインストリームになってる。
私とあと全体の3D とかも含めてコンポジットの統合を 補佐してくれる。
悪い意味じゃないんですけど、こだわらずにどんどん新しいことをチャレンジさせてくれた方だったので、すごいいろんなことができて面白かったですね。今回一緒にやってたスタッフっていうかアドバイザーとしてマイケル・アリアさんっていう方がいらっしゃって、でその人はソフトの開発者でもあるんで。
That's sort of my thing, and that's like the software that I've been working on for the last 8 years has been a means of integrating 3D computer graphics with the cell animation pipeline.
やっぱり実写の中で CG を使う場合だとどうリアリティを追求していくかっていうか、自然に現実にあるような CG を作っていくのかって作っていくと思うんですけど、アニメの場合ってまた違くって、どう絵の世界に馴染むように CG 臭くないような絵を作るためにっていうような苦労が多かったんですが、下カットっていうとロボットとか人間側でないメカの方をほぼ CG の方で作ったんですね。でモデリングからアニメーションまでつけて。
Tons of computer graphics in Second Renaissance, or really places that you wouldn't expect it either.
いうことを目標にして作ってきてたので、それは 3D という技術を使うことによってカメラワークからエフェクトがそれはセルであろうと 3D であろうと何を道具として使おうと画面として一つのマッチングした世界が作れると。
He really pushed some of the kind of allegorical elements that are implicit in Andy and Larry's original story.
肉体的に非常にその攻撃をして、そしてその自分たちのエネルギーに確保していくっていうところはものすごく残酷で、でもそれを彼は書くことが必要であるならばということで、全くてらいもなくものすごくそこをリアルに描ききった。もう見ていてもものすごくその辛くなるようなドラマを作り上げたって、そこはやっぱり素晴らしいなというふうに思ってます。
1 year and 5 months ですね、次はまだ秘密なんですけど。
Only the most exceptional people become aware of the Matrix. Those that learn it exists must possess a rare degree of intuition, sensitivity, and a questioning nature.
Kawajiri-san came up with 2 stories, Program and World Record.
それで、ワールドレコードのシナリオっていうのはね、割と走るシーンっていうのはね、そんなに長くはなかったんですよ。むしろそのマトリックスを知った、その部分が、ちょっとネオと後半の活躍がネオとやっぱちょっとダブってしまうっていうことで、そこをなんとかしたいんだという話だったんです。でミーティングでラリーとアンディがそれを果たせないっていうのはどうだろうと。これはちょっとアクションがあんまりないけど大丈夫かなっていうのはちょっと不安だったんでね。で俺はその部分が自信ないんだって言ってアンディとラリーに言ったんだけど、それは何言ってんですか、それはもうまたわすがね、川尻こういう経験なの、私は何も心配してないとかって勝手に言われて。
One thing that I like about World Record is that I really get the feeling while watching it of a young director finding his voice. When you see an artist blossoming, it's kind of a really exciting thing.
高校卒業してマッドハウスっていうアニメーションスタジオに入社して、主に川尻監督の、映画のプロジェクトに作画として参加しました。入社してからもう10年ぐらいはずっと川尻監督の作品に作画のスタッフとして。
じゃあ小池はもうワールドレコードの方に専念してっていう形を取ったんですけど、で彼はその前に自分のキャラクターデザインでのちょっとした、短いもんですけど、そういうのをちょうどやりだした時期だったんで、彼のスタイルっていうのはやっぱすごくみんなが注目してたんでね、これはもう今絶対やらしたいなと。
脚本をいただいた段階でもう割とやりたいようにやってくれっていうスタンスで、一つ注文があったとすれば、小池が描く走りのアクションが見たいと、スローのアクションが見たい、 筋肉の躍動が見たいと。
彼はそれに対して、ほぼ、彼が中心となってメインとなる動きの部分というのを書いて制作がされていきました。
期待しつつ、彼にお願いしたんだけど、コンテ見たらね、コンテ見たらもうこれは面白くなるっていうふうにもう確信できた、
そこの微妙なバランスで筋肉の動きを微妙にデフォルメしながら元に戻りつつまた歪むっていうのをすごく気をつけて表現しました。実際にも動きを、スローとかで何回も勉強して、足よりも割と手を最後振り上げるところのインパクトを強くすると力強い感じになるっていうのを発見して、そこをすごく表彰して、アニメートしました。
He's always very observant and all, you know, get the feeling that he's really learning stuff as he goes.
アメリカに何回か一緒に行った時もですね、必ず常にメモとペンを持ってですね、道路を走っている車を見てもそこで思いついたことをメモすると。で、私見せてもらったんですが、ただそこには、インスピレーションの言葉しか書いてないんですよ。これが一体どういうふうになるんですかと聞いても、いや、彼の中ではその記憶に残ったショット、そういったシーン、自分が感動したものを全部キーワードで書き留めておくと、後で作品を作っていった時に、そういったものを入れ込めるんだという形で。
僕のキャラクターの、個性としてはまずデフォルメをするっていうことなんですけど、ただデフォルメをするだけだと崩れてる絵になっちゃうので、リアルな感じを持たせながら手を大きくしたり、その辺のバランスを考えて、キャラクターを作ってます。僕が周りのアニメーターと違うところは、まずキャラクターのシルエットとして BL の影オンリーで、絵を表現すること。それはキャラクターだけじゃなくて背景も含めて、全体の画面として影の陰影をきっちり出して作るスタイルでアニメーションの表現をしてます。影をきっちり出すことによって立体の表現を個性を出せるっていうか、絵のスタイルとして個性を出せる表現方法として一番表現方法かなと思ってます。
He cannot wake up. Do not let him wake up.
You try to work into it all these sounds that are extreme exaggerations of the physical parts of his body and the efforts that are required to make it feel as much in the head as we could possibly do. The audience will feel like, man, it couldn't possibly make that much sound making a step when you're running, or stretching your legs, or snapping a tendon, or whatever's going on in the piece. And yet we want them to feel like what it would feel like if that was your tendon snapping.
I think World Record actually was less like the Matrix music than the other animes. World Record is more kind of understated, subdued, kind of music just subtly commenting on what was on the screen. It was less overt film scoring.
Dan Davis of the United States finishes with a time of 8.72 seconds, a new world record.
すごい興奮してます。音作りの作り込み恵まれた環境で今回のプロジェクトに参加できてすごく嬉しく思ってます。
I just think the world record is just a really original looking cartoon. It doesn't look like any other Japanese animation. It's got a lot in common with some of Peter Chung's work. I think Koike has been influenced a lot by Peter's work. I think Koike has learned some cool lessons from Kawajiri about just economy and the power of the image.
それはやっぱり周りの人間がね、想像以上にすごいものが出てきたんで、本当にすごく喜んでるし、やっぱワールドレコード見てもやっぱりちょっとあんだけかっこいい絵描くやつちょっといねえだろうな。
There are two ways of looking at animated film: to emphasize the animated aspect of it or the film aspect of it. I think in the US the tendency is to evaluate it as animation. And I think in Japan the tendency is to put the emphasis on the film part. And it's filmmaking first, animation second.
I mean, I was always a fan of anime. When Akira came out, I saw it. I thought it was fantastic. But The Boys opened my eyes to it. The Wachowski brothers showed me Ghost in the Shell, and they showed me what they wanted to do with that type of action and photography and try to make it with real people, with real actors, and create a hybrid.
その表現の方法としても日本の漫画で、よく使われるカッティングであるとか絵作り、アニメーションの中で使われる演出、香港のワイヤーアクションの、独特な世界観、こういったですね世界中のあらゆるさまざまな映像の素材というのをかなり高い次元で融合させて、それをなおかつライブアクションでやってしまったというのがですね非常に衝撃でした。
アニメーションを見てるような感覚で見ていましたね。
It seemed like they were animating their actors the way an animator would manipulate an animated character.
やっぱりそのカット割りだとかね、そういうとこで自分もよくやるようなカット割り、と似てるなとかっていうふうには思ったんだけど、やっぱり実写でやるとそれが全然味わいが違っちゃうし、やっぱ実写でここまでやられちゃったら俺ら次にどうやって使ったらすごい映像作れるかなっていうところがやっぱり非常に、不安にもさせてくれたね。
それを見せられたらまたそれに負けないような映像を作りたいなっていう風な、意欲も湧いてくるし、いろんな意味で、影響あった作品と思います。
I remember somebody said to me, "The movie is so Japanese," and then I remember when I was in Spain, they said the movie is so Spanish. But I of course think it's very Jewish, but that's where I'm from. We went to Japan in September of '99 after the movie opened to do a Japanese press junket.
ラリー&アンディがですね日本に来た時に彼らが見たい場所というのがテレビゲームの開発会社の、スタジオの中を見たい。
At the same time, meet all the Japanese anime directors and all the entities that do the Japanese anime because they were fans and we were trying to figure out a way to use it.
当然そのアイディアも非常にたくさんのさまざまなアイディアも浮かぶんですが、何よりもその日本のですねこういった漫画であるとかアニメーションであるとかフィギュアであるとかそういったポップカルチャーの部分をとてもよく日本人以上に研究して知り尽くしていると。
We found this terrific talent, a very talented guy named Mike Arias, who was actually a friend of John Gaeta, who was our head of visual effects on Matrix movies. And we met Mike, and he is an American guy living in Japan.
I took him over to Studio 4 Degrees, which is where we've ended up doing most of the Animatrix.
これはねすごく記念すべき、私にもすごい楽しい話なんだけれども、マトリックスを公開するときにジョエル・シルバーさんとアンディ・アンドラリー・ウォシャクスキーさんがアロハシャツでそれでサンダル履きでペタペタペタとこのスタジオに遊びに来てくれたんですね。
I think they were just really feeling the situation out.
We had the opportunity to really incorporate traditional anime in some fashion that would incorporate elements of the story in a new way. And we didn't know how to do it at first. We thought maybe we'd do a television show. We thought maybe we might do one anime feature.
I ended up spending the whole week with these guys and seeing The Matrix for the first time at the Japanese premiere. And, you know, I was blown away too. It was very, who are these guys? Where did they come from? And how did John Gaeta pull this off? Like a total slacker.
I remember on the plane ride back, Larry sat down with a yellow pad and kind of mapped out this scheme that we would do where we would have the movie and video game and these animated stories and how they would all kind of interact together. And we made the decision to do a series of 9 or 10 short animated tales, yarns that would be in and around the Matrix.
When we first started, it was very much 10 6-minute episodes. Now it's like 9 episodes and they're anywhere between 6 minutes and 16 minutes.
The boys did not want to direct these episodes. They wanted to find high-end Japanese animation directors who could bring to the table their own style and their own ideas. The brothers wrote 4 of the episodes themselves and collaborated with the directors on the other episodes.
I've been very impressed by how open they are to other people's ideas. ideas.
They really wanted to give them the freedom to make these stories their own. And I think they did that because they're all coming from the same place, but they approach it all so differently.
今までですね、これ日本だけではなく海外も含めてこれだけビッグでこれだけの監督さんたちを一堂に集めたプロジェクトというのはありませんでした。
Larry and Andy appreciate the history of Japanese anime. They revel in it. They love animation. So Japanese anime is probably one of the most significant influences on them and on these movies. I mean, Japanese anime is not a new thing. I mean, it's been around forever.
The modern Japanese comic is a fusion of two things. It's a fusion of Western form, which is basically the grammar for modern comic books, which was developed in the United States. That was fused onto an indigenous tradition. It goes back hundreds, even 1,000 years, of art that entertains, and it's mainly line art.
That manga are really an outgrowth or just the sort of modern expression of the same artistic vibes that inspired the great ukiyo-e, the Japanese woodblock printmakers of the 19th and 18th centuries, and even before that, the old Buddhist scroll makers.
You'd unroll them from right to left, and as you unrolled them, there would be a story that would unfold. And then later on, you had the emergence of woodblock prints, which were a way to mass-produce visual art, and they depicted more popular subjects, often such as kabuki actors, natural scenes, but they were also compiled into books and used to tell stories in sequence, so they were very similar to today's comics in many senses.
But then they, in the 1920s, I think it was, they discovered the funnies in America. They started drawing, story comics as opposed to these one-panel things.
All the forms of Japan anime out there, you have this constant interest in history. Many of the primary works are historically based. So it becomes a reflection of history and a reflection on history. And all of this comes out of a greater search for identity at the heart of all this work. Anime rose directly out of the post-war situation in Japan after World War II, specifically out of manga comics.
I think there are a lot of reasons that comic book culture, manga culture exploded after the war. One of them, I think, had to do with the pent-up demand for entertainment, because people had been living under a lot of privation and they'd been suffering a lot.
Most of the theaters in metropolitan Japan were gone. Movies might be displayed on a white wall of a building with chairs laid outside. The Japanese movie industry in the late 40s was virtually non-existent.
There were some artists who appeared at this time. The most famous one of all is Osamu Tezuka, who's regarded as the sort of god of manga and anime. He took the American comic book format and he started experimenting with it, and he developed a much more visually oriented style that drove the kids wild in Japan.
You would have action that would just kind of leak into the next panel and then permeate the next one. So your eye is kind of traveling at a faster rate.
He took many of the things that he saw in Disney animation or even Max Fleischer animation, and many of those elements, and tried to sort of replicate them on the physical page. And as a result, many of his early characters look very much like Max Fleischer characters and even early Disney characters. At the beginning of the 50s on, the kids who were reading manga kept reading them as they aged, and the industry increasingly targeted them, and the market expanded and expanded.
And now, any genre you'll find in literature. Hard-boiled detective, sappy love stories, science fiction, fantasy tales, stray adventure stories, stories about everyday life.
They put every subject matter into comic books. We have a tendency here to think that, if it's not Archie comics or superhero comic books, well, what could it possibly be?
They're manga about, loan sharks. They're manga about housewives. They're mangas about, people who are unemployed, office workers.
There's mahjong ones, right? And then you have got grappler fighting ones.
And some are for females and some are for males. It's like broken up that way, but then there's ones for kids, ones for adults, ones for perverts.
Like all these topics that you wouldn't imagine are popular, but everybody reads them.
Manga are a true mass medium, and when Americans and Europeans look at manga, one of the problems they have is they're often viewing them in the context of comic books, which are such a mini market in the United States.
You can go on the subway in Japan and you'll see anybody from 6 to 60 sitting there, huddled tightly against the other people reading their book, and nobody looks down at them, which I find always amusing here because, the same people that throw their nose up at you going, oh, you mean comic book, are the same people that go to action movies up to the age of 50. You go, action movies are just comic books, really, when you get right down to it.
So it's a huge industry, and it's a huge part of Japanese culture that's hard for people outside of Japan to understand.
It really began what we think of as anime with Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy. That was a Pinocchio story.
Tezuka put together a production studio to create a TV animation. So he created the first Japanese black and white TV animation in 1963 and followed that very quickly with the first full color animation series, which we know in the United States is Kimba the White Lion.
Early animation in every country has to cut corners like any commercial product. You have to do things in a way that meets your budget. So Tezuka developed a marvelous sequence of things which would give an impression of motion and action and things.
Which now we call limited animation. The more drawings you have in a second, the smoother the action will look. So they've come up with all kinds of ways to limit the amount of time for which smooth motion has to be created as a way of lowering the production costs.
And you might have a very large drawing and the camera might physically pan over this one drawing. You have motion as the camera pans over the drawing. You don't have a huge number of cells painted by people.
かなり短期間に作るということですよね。ローバジェットで短期間に作ることには長けてると思います。
That's the one thing that the Japanese do way grander than us, is that they figured out how to cheat your way, if you will, through the process, and in the good moments actually convince you that they weren't cheating.
It often looks just like reading manga. Often the frames are semi-frozen. The characters don't move as rapidly as, say, Disney animation.
And you find poses and angles from which the characters look good, and you play to those and use dialogue and cutting and the settings more than an American director might.
If you slide static images, it looks like things are moving because the perspective of your eye changes as you come up over a hill. And as you turn a corner, everything moves on you. So if you move something in the background and you move the people in the middle ground and everything's going like this at a different rate, you see motion. Motion equals animation.
There's more emphasis on close-ups of faces, sort of freezing of the frame where they're focusing on the eyes and the emotion. A lot of Americans look at Japanese animation and Japanese comics and they are sort of puzzled by the look of the characters. They often have big eyes and they often look Caucasian, and that's partly due to some of the techniques that Tezuka established. His model was really American animation.
These anime babes, they have the same big eyes, the same voluptuous figure, and they're cute and bouncy and speaking squeaky little voices just like Betty Boop.
Where did she come from?
There's cross-pollination there, I think it's somewhat similar. I mean, Astro Boy has 2 points on his head, like Mickey Mouse had 2 ears.
One tip-off watching a Japanese film is if the character has large eyes, he or she is probably on the good side. If they've got small eyes, they are probably not, because they're not sensitive. It's very much the windows of the soul.
It's nothing to do with Japan at all. It's just a convention that was established.
It's anime style.
You get sequences in which there seems to be very little action going on. They have these beautiful slow moments that are very atmospheric because they want to.
Historically in Japan, there's been this emphasis on the non-stated, on the vacuum space, and on the frozen element. So even in Japanese novels, there's a lot of emphasis on implied meaning. And part of that comes out of the language. This Japanese language relies so heavily on implied meaning. There are many things that are not directly stated.
引き算ですね。そうそう。アメリカの方が足し算だとすると、日本のそういうものの表現ってなんか伝統的に引き算がかっこいいみたいなところがあると思うんですよね。言い過ぎはかっこよくないとか。
I kind of regard the individual drawings in an animated film almost like brush strokes in a painting, and traditional Western art is interested in creating an illusion of nature
whereas traditional Eastern painting is more about the gesture of the painter.
And they use a lot of speed lines and motion, and they just want you to believe that that guy's running a million miles an hour, that guy's flying. We're here, when you do Spider-Man, you know, we have a tendency in Superman to show the building behind them to still create the illusion, and we don't necessarily have the confidence maybe in our audience that, you know, we established them jumping out of the building 2 panels ago, that they're still flying. We don't have to show it every panel, every panel, every panel.
One of the delicious tropes of anime, which I think is a direct influence on the Matrix, is this savory anticipation before the violence erupts. You get this kind of freeze frame in action, this pause, right before there's often extreme violence or a moment of great action. It's a dramatic pause. You're propelled along, and then you abruptly stop. The sound will even drop out. And then, because you already have this fluidity between foreground and background, you can get these crazy things and this zoom in. Slowing up of time, or this incredible pan, or the camera moving through space. It's like not only are you stopping before it happens and looking at it, but you're gonna walk around it and see it from a million different points of view, and like do a close-up of like that bit of horror, you know, just before, you know, when it's got a psychic effect instead of a physical effect.
As the economy continued to grow and that industry continued to expand, they just moved out in all directions into a variety of graphic styles, to the use of color, development of features, of direct-to-video projects, and of broadcast television projects, and produced an extraordinary body of work during the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
By the time mid-60s had come along, the anime had started to flow into this country with stuff like Speed Racer. By the time Battleship Yamato and G-Force and that stuff started coming in, American productions just seemed tame by comparison.
In the 70s, some people start noticing that this is like something else.
It started out very small. The first organized clubs were an offshoot of science fiction fandom.
The thing that was the exclusive preserve of a very small group of geeks who watched bootleg tapes or films in Japanese when very often they didn't speak Japanese.
By the 80s, you have this huge fanboy subculture.
And in the late 80s, you had things like Akira being done. When it made the art house theaters in the US, it really had an impact. For a lot of Americans, for a long time, if you mentioned anime, they would think Akira.
Anyone who was into like action movies saw that and was like, wow, you know, they can only be blown away by that.
You can say that Akira is a story of post-apocalyptic Japan, but the fact is that Japanese society itself is post-apocalyptic. I mean, Japan had atom bombs dropped on it, and I really think that influences every art movement that you see in Japan after the war. I mean, it's all post-apocalyptic.
And so having seen the apocalypse up close, I think that's just an important element in their psychology and something that they cannot help but be aware of.
The first frame of Akira is the mushroom cloud.
Fandom really expanded dramatically in the 90s with the growth of college clubs.
College theaters got a hold of those films and just played them over and over and over. They became midnight things. When I was in college, Akira and Ghost of the Shell played forever.
People would trade tapes with their own subtitles added on.
Maybe embarrassed to have tape sometimes.
Yeah.
It's like an embarrassing thing, you know. It's really closeted. But some people we know started off trading tapes, maybe having bootleg tapes, and then they went on to open up their own stores, you know, legitimate stores. So it's kind of like the way rappers used to sell stuff out of their trunk.
Late 80s, early 90s, you have this huge explosion. It's still not entirely mainstream, but you have Time it is mainstream. You have Time magazine doing stories on Japan and May.
The introduction of Japanese animation on video, which is now a $500 million a year industry in this country. The increased broadcasting of Japanese programs on TV.
Now you can get it at, major chains and stuff, and there'll be anime sections and huge tech stores. And and it shows up in commercials and big movies now.
And that's sort of a moment which allows the inclusiveness of Matrix.
This is a Japanese product, and yet it's causing Americans to get together, Americans to connect with each other in a very, I think, very positive way.
Maybe that's our hope here, is that it's here, that it's the next generation that will go, no, that's equally as good if not better, and we grew up with it. We accept, outside culture sort of ideas, and maybe that's how we have to get that thing going from a trickle to a full-blown flood. That'd actually be nice.
In the United States, we've built all these little fences around animation and said, essentially, the medium can't go here. That certain sorts of violent actions, certain kinds of relationships, sexual activities, intellectual content just aren't appropriate for animation in this country. In Japan, none of those boundaries exist.
日本のやつはよりその世界観とかムードとか、あとそのお話ですよね。日本のアニメってのはその映画ではなくて漫画でもなくて絵物語と映画のちょっと間ぐらいのところにあるような気がするんですよね。だからその
Like Garage Rock, it works as long as there's soul behind it.